If we did that, then we'd have the Austrians, Prussians, Russians, British, everybody landing on the North American continent to destroy the United States. The point is, we are not designed as a republic, as a people, to fight large wars on the Eurasian continent. Because you mentioned money going to Ukraine. Well, most of the money never gets to Ukraine. The money pays for equipment. The money is then laundered through the Pentagon and back into the defense industries to pay for replacements.
So you wrote a book a couple years ago called Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern War. You're talking about sort of the changes in all of that. What, if any, now are some of the history lessons that we can learn from those battles? Does it even apply anymore? Because you're right, we're waging a different war. We could build a 1,000 aircraft carriers next week, and it doesn't really mean anything given where war is going and what people can have as countermeasures to them. Exactly. What are some of those lessons that we can learn from those battles, if it's still applicable?
Well, I wrote the opening chapter for Americans because it's all about something called the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. The British rather haphazardly stumbled into World War I, suddenly saying that the survival and victory of the French was vital to their interest after having fought the French for 800 years. Rather a miraculous transformation. So they sent this 150,000-man force over initially. Eventually, it grew to about 200,000. They were largely professionals, but they also had a lot of reservists, but experienced soldiers. And this army performed brilliantly, and it was largely annihilated by the Germans. They paved the road to Paris with the dead of the British Expeditionary Force. The lesson of that is we, Americans, are not a continental power. The British were never a continental power. We are primarily maritime and aerospace powers. We try to solve our problems as much as we can with air and naval power. We don't like to put large numbers of people ashore to fight anywhere because they have a bad habit of getting killed. World War I was a great example. We sent 2 million men over there, and in 110 days of fighting, we had 318,000 casualties, including 110,000 dead. What was the result of that? We didn't have another Democrat in office after Wilson until 1932 when the Depression hit. People were furious. We should never have fought in that war. We should never have been in World War I. That's what most people thought at the time, and they were right. We didn't want to become involved in these continental wars that absorb millions and millions of casualties. Thomas Jefferson wanted us to join the French in the French Revolution. And Washington said, I like Tom. He's a nice man, but I think he's a little crazy. If we did that, then we'd have the Austrians, Prussians, Russians, British, everybody landing on the North American continent to destroy the United States. The point is, we are not designed as a republic, as a people, to fight large wars on the Eurasian continent. We don't usually field millions of men in armies. We have no history of that. We're not geared for it. We don't want to do it. Again, the President Trump I'm talking about, understood this instinctively. Americans don't want to fight in these wars. So now we have forces in Europe, we have forces in Asia, then they're positioned right on the edge of these conflict zones. And today, all of them could be erased in the space of minutes by precision-guided missiles, because everything is detectable from above. So there is no value to putting a large force 6,000 miles away from the United States on the border of a potential opponent. All you're doing is offering them up for destruction. That was the key lesson to take out of World War I and the British Expeditionary Force. We're not going to build forces of millions who are going to fight. We don't do that. So we have to limit our interventionist impulse. We have to limit what we do to places where our interests are clearly and narrowly focused, and where if we do engage, we benefit strategically. That, again, was President Trump's message. That's why he told the Europeans, you've got to become your own first responders. Stop waiting for us to show up and rescue you. But he concluded, I think, very rightly, that until we get out of Europe completely or mostly, no one over there is going to spend the money to defend themselves. And that's the problem.
So what, speaking of debacles, What should Biden have done to complete Trump's order to get out of Afghanistan? I think no one wanted to be in the never-ending wars. It feels like until Ukraine sort of became the new religion of the left, I think the one thing that the American populace actually agreed on is that we didn't want to be in the never-ending wars. So what should Biden have done to get out of Afghanistan without creating the disaster? Because I think there's a way to do it. I think there's probably a fairly clear way to do it. But what do you see as that? They tried rushing it. They did it out of the, in the fighting season instead of in the winter when people are hiding in caves. And it seems like a lot of obvious ones. But, as someone who's been there, as someone who's commanded these, what could they have done differently?
Well, the very first thing is what you pointed to. You don't leave in the dead of summer when all the snakes have crawled out from underneath their rocks and are prepared to bite you. So that was big mistake number one. They'd have been better off waiting until November of the year, October, November, and then instead of announcing your intention to withdraw, you need to begin immediately taking equipment out. In other words, identify everything that you want to keep, that you're not going to leave behind, and start getting it out of the country. That's going to take some time. But if you do it intelligently, it can be done in 60 to 90 days. The other thing is that you don't identify Kabul, this airport right next to the city, as your departure point. That was the wrong place to leave from. And then finally, we have this airfield that we built in northwestern Afghanistan. That wasn't something that we necessarily needed to completely abandon. That had some strategic value beyond.
You're talking about Bagram, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, strategic value, like it sits, close to the border of China. Like probably a good one to keep, but minor details.
It made sense to hold on to that. But again, these things don't appear to be addressed. And then the other thing is, we learned from Iraq. If you tell everybody exactly when you're leaving and where you're going to go from, you get shot to pieces. When we finally left Iraq in 2011, we left in the dark in the middle of the night after telling nobody we were leaving. That's how we got out without getting people killed, because you have no friends you can trust. This is crazy.
Yeah.
Everyone is going to rat you out. As soon as you told the Iraqi army anything, everybody knew it. And that meant you were going to get killed. So the bottom line is, in Afghanistan, every conceivable strategic mistake that could be made was made. And we just kept coming up with excuses to keep people there, once again, because you mentioned money going to Ukraine. Well, most of the money never gets to Ukraine. The money pays for equipment. The money is then laundered through the Pentagon and back into the defense industries to pay for replacements. In turn, you get donations on the Hill rewarding everybody for supporting this fiasco. So the amount of money that actually shows up on the ground is minuscule. And what does show up there pays for the Ukrainian government, just as we paid for the Iraqi government and the Afghan government and the South Vietnamese government. We can go down this list. It's the same insanity over and over and over again. All of it is designed to maintain the fiction that we're doing something good and important. It's not. It never was.
When you look at some of the, other presidential candidates out there besides my father, do any of them actually seem prepared to you to take on the major crises facing the U.S. on a world stage right now?
Well, let me give that some thought. No, none of them. I mean, if you look at this man,
I had a feeling. Listen, it's always risky putting that out there. You never know. But I hear what you've been saying, and I'm looking at the other, some of the stuff going on there right now. I see the people who flip-flop because of their donors in 2 seconds on, some pretty major issues. I'm saying, you know what? Let's send this one out there.
Well, when you look at somebody like DeSantis, and I'm sure Governor DeSantis is a terribly nice guy. That's not the issue. But when he announces very logically, we have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine that justifies our investment there or the commitment of any military power, which was correct. And then just a few days later, after his donors contact him, says, well, I guess I was wrong. It's really important for us to be there. I mean, you want to put that guy into office? What a catastrophe. I can't imagine. That's the last thing we need. Everybody fails to understand something about President Trump. He didn't go to Washington to get rich. Yeah. Too many people do. That's our problem. Government has become lucrative.
Yeah, the biggest lie, there's a lot of lies. Reagan had a couple of good ones about, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help. Like, that's a pretty big lie. But the other one is the whole lie of, public servant. Once they get to D.C., maybe there's one or two, but man, that's been bastardized a lot, as evidenced by, Nancy Pelosi being a lifetime public servant and being worth a couple $100 million. I mean, that doesn't happen if they're actually public servants, So the D.C. swamp is a disaster. But, for me, it was interesting is, growing up, generals, were our heroes. You'd spoken about, we've spoken about Patton, we've spoken about MacArthur. But what happened? Are there any generals left that we could look up to now for real leadership? Are there others in there? And maybe if there are, maybe don't mention them by name, because if you do, they'll probably be on the chopping block, in the new woke military tomorrow. But, what happened? Are there guys still out there that we could look up to for real leadership? Are there guys, that are children, at least those of, patriotic Americans, that could look up to be like, I want to be like that guy. Because, I'm not aware of any right now that are in there. I see the stuff daily, and the guys I respect from the military, most of them are operators and door kickers. They're saying, I can't believe I signed up to defend this crap that I see coming out of them every day.
We select people for senior leadership, for flag rank, for many reasons, but in most cases, they have nothing to do with demonstrated character, competence, or intelligence. We pick people because we like them and because they're just like us. And in peacetime, where there is no tension, there is no compulsion to get anything right. And frankly, when you fight the kinds of enemies we have, where virtually anything you do works, you're not dealing with an enemy army, an enemy air force. You have no air attack to worry about. You have overwhelming firepower. So, under those circumstances, there is no call for any professional competence. And again, in this chapter in the book, Margin of Victory, it's one of the things I talked about early on. You had British general officers that were very successful in India and Africa who failed miserably in front of the Germans. Mm-hmm. The French had similar problems, though not as severe as the British. It's very hard. So you've got to change that. And of course, now we want to select everybody on the basis of race. And if you're going to compete in that environment, then you have to be subservient, as I would expect a white man or a Northeast Asian, to the wokeness. Demonstrate your fealty and readiness to implement these destructive policies that are divisive and will cripple us militarily. So I have no faith in any of them anymore. If there are any of real character, God bless them, but I haven't found out about them. And I'm perfectly willing to just clean it out and reach low and find people who are competent. That is what Marshall did. And it's not personal. If you pick the wrong guy, you fire him and replace him. There's nothing special about it. Somebody said, well, what is a general? And I finally told this senator, it's a colonel you promoted. That's it.
Yeah.
What's a colonel? It's a lieutenant colonel you promoted. Come on, let's wake up.
Yeah. And the guy who you actually want in that position is the guy that's never going to get the nod because he isn't going to pledge fealty to the woke bullshit. He is going to say what needs to be said. He is going to ruffle feathers to ask the questions that those in the D.C. establishment and those in the military-industrial complex don't want the American public to hear asked, because they may actually have to answer them rather than cashing billion-dollar checks paid for courtesy of the American taxpayer.
Well, remember, it's also a case of when you go to confirmation with the current bunch, the people sitting in it say they don't care about the individual, whether that individual actually knows anything.
Yeah.
They're very concerned about whether or not he's going to keep the money flowing.
Yeah.
Are you going to maintain the programs that are there? Are my constituents and donors going to benefit? Are you going to go along with the policies? There's no question about military competence, demonstrated. What have you done, General, that justifies your advancement to this position? Explain it. And most can't, because the only thing they've done is go from job to job without notice.
Yeah.